Spring 1945, the war in Europe is almost over. But no one here knows what tomorrow will look like. A cold morning mist hangs over the Rhine Valley as a convoy of olive-drab American trucks rolls to a halt outside a newly expanded prisoner of war camp. The engines idle in a low, growling rhythm. Canvas flaps tremble in the breeze. The metallic rattle of the gate echoes across the compound like a warning. Inside the last truck, dozens of German women sit pressed shoulder to shoulder Luftwaffe communications helpers, Wehrmacht clerks, and signal operators, still wearing the faded gray of the collapsing Reich. Their boots are muddy, their faces hollow from weeks of retreat. For days they had moved westward with the remains of broken units, only to be overtaken by an American patrol outside a ruined village. Now a guard yanks open the flap, and daylight floods in. One by one, the women step down onto the gravel. Their breaths catch not from fear, but from surprise. Towering above them, framed against the wire and the watchtowers, stand the American guards, broad-shouldered, well-fed, heavy uniforms, thick belts, tall boots. To many of these women, raised on propaganda that painted Americans as crude and weak, the sheer physical size of the men feels unreal. A moment of stunned silence settles. Because before any orders are spoken, everything they thought they knew about the enemy is already beginning to fracture. From total war to total defeat. How German women reached the front lines. By 1943, the Third Reich was running out of time, though few inside Germany dared to say it aloud. The defeats in North Africa had severed Hitler's last foothold on the southern Mediterranean. The disaster at Stalingrad had stunned the nation, leaving hundreds of thousands dead or captured. And in the West, British and American bombers were carving new wounds into German cities every night. The war that had once seemed distant now seeped into every street, every home, every family. And it was in this tightening vice that the Nazi state made a decision it had resisted for years, to pull women into military service in unprecedented numbers. The call went out first quietly, then urgently. Women were needed to fill the roles left behind by men being sent to the front. But German propaganda insisted they were not soldiers. They were Helferinnen helpers, supporters, assistants to the fighting men of the Reich. Their work, it was claimed, preserved the purity of the nation's ideals while still contributing to victory. Reality was less poetic. Training camps opened across Germany. Many converted from existing Luftwaffe and Army facilities. Young women, some barely 18, were taught to operate communications boards, teleprinters, radios, searchlights, or anti-aircraft observation posts. Others filled clerical roles in battalion headquarters or logistics units. Their uniforms resembled those of their male counterparts, minus the combat gear, but their work placed them close to danger all the same. By 1944, the Allied front was closing in from all directions. In France, the Normandy landings ruptured Hitler's western defenses. In Italy, German forces were pushed north through brutal mountain warfare. To the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly, forcing millions of civilians to flee. The idea that the front was far away evaporated almost overnight. As the situation worsened, female auxiliaries found themselves stationed closer to combat zones than anyone had intended. Communications detachments worked behind frontline command posts. Anti-aircraft auxiliaries endured nightly air raids, their stations rocked by explosions as cities burned below. For many, the whine of approaching bombers became part of everyday life. Despite their hardships, these women were fed a steady stream of propaganda. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and training lectures painted Americans as undisciplined, racially mixed, and physically unimpressive. A force supposedly held together not by strength or honor, but by money and machinery. They were described as decadent, greedy, crude, nothing like the heroic German soldier. But even inside Germany, reality was harder to hide each month. Rations grew thinner. Bombing raids destroyed food depots. Factories struggled to function. And as the Allied front pressed into Western Germany in late 1944, auxiliary units, especially communications groups, found themselves retreating alongside fractured divisions. Trucks roared along muddy roads day and night, carrying not just wounded soldiers but clerks, telephone operators, and radio staff who now found themselves on the move for survival. For women stationed near the Ardennes, the winter offensive of December 1944 offered a momentary illusion that Germany still had strength left. When the attack collapsed, the retreat became desperate. Units dissolved, regrouped, and dissolved again. Command posts changed location sometimes twice a day. Maps grew meaningless. Orders came through crackling radio sets that barely worked. The front was no longer a line, it was a tide. And it was sweeping them along with it. That by early 1945, news of what the Red Army had done in East Prussia and Silesia spread quickly. Often exaggerated, but terrifying nonetheless. Stories of brutality, revenge, and retribution pushed many westward, determined to avoid falling into Soviet hands. To them, American capture, though frightening, felt like a lesser, unknown. Columns of retreating auxiliaries often marched alongside elderly men from the Volkssturm, wounded soldiers patched with makeshift bandages, and civilians carrying whatever they could strap to bicycles or pushcarts. Hunger gnawed at everyone. Air raids struck without warning. Bridges collapsed under demolition charges. Days blurred into nights, filled with distant artillery and the constant low hum of engines. It was during these chaotic movements that many German women were overtaken by American advances. Reconnaissance units pushed swiftly into collapsing defensive sectors. Armored columns cut supply roads, surrounded pockets of resistance, and intercepted fleeing convoys. Capture usually came without a fight. Some groups signaled surrender immediately. Others were found sheltering in abandoned buildings or waiting anxiously at crossroads for instructions that never arrived. American MPs and infantrymen, often surprised to encounter entire groups of women in uniform, processed them cautiously, unsure whether to treat them as soldiers, auxiliaries, or civilians. But the women's journey didn't end at the moment of surrender. Instead, it carried them deeper into American-controlled territory. Toward camps designed for a war, Germany no longer had the strength to continue, and as trucks carried them west toward the Rhine, they had no idea that their first real confrontation with the enemy would not come from a rifle barrel, but from the towering silhouette of the men guarding the gates. Inside the American system, camps built for men, suddenly holding women. By the beginning of 1945, the United States had become the single largest jailer of German prisoners in the world. What had started as a trickle of captured troops in North Africa had swelled into an unmanageable flood after Normandy, the Falaise Pocket, the Battle of the Bulge, and the collapse of Germany's western defenses. By war's end, more than 400,000 German POWs would be held in American custody across Europe and the United States. The American system they entered was not improvised. It had been built with the precision of an industrial nation, accustomed to managing vast resources and vast distances. Every major division had military police units trained in POW handling. Every camp followed standardized procedures derived from the 1929 Geneva Convention. Every prisoner was accounted for, documented, and regulated. Most importantly, these camps had been designed with one assumption: they would hold men. Only men. Thousands and thousands of them. So when German female auxiliaries began arriving in American custody, the system struggled to adapt to something it had never planned for: the architecture of captivity. American POW camps varied in size and purpose, but most shared a common layout. A central compound, rectangular, efficiently organized, was surrounded by tall barbed wire fences. Guard towers rose at each corner, manned day and night. Inside, wooden barracks lined straight gravel roads, each structure built to house dozens of prisoners. There were mess halls, latrines, washhouses, infirmaries, administrative huts, and where space allowed recreation fields. Some facilities were newly built in Europe. Others were enormous compounds spread across the American interior: Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Alabama, Nebraska. In these places, the horizon stretched so far that many German prisoners said it felt as if they had reached the edge of the world. But regardless of location, every camp functioned like a small, self-contained town governed by military regulation. Into this vast machinery arrived the first groups of German women. A legal puzzle. The Americans faced an immediate question: were these women soldiers? POWs? Civilians attached to a military force? Something in between? The Geneva Convention made no specific provision for female enemy personnel captured in uniform but not classified as combat troops. The U.S. Army decided pragmatically: treat them as POWs, but keep them segregated, supervised, and protected. That meant reassigning barracks, modifying latrines, setting up separate compounds, and adjusting guard rosters. In some cases, female American personnel, WACS nurses, clerks, were brought in to handle processing tasks that male guards were not permitted to perform. But the WAC organization had its own responsibilities, and such assistance was not always available. Thus the U.S. Army improvised. Women were housed in smaller, isolated sections within larger camps. American female medical staff performed examinations. Into this vast machinery arrived the first groups of German women. Legal puzzle. The Americans faced an immediate question: were these women soldiers? POWs? Civilians attached to a military force? Something in between? The Geneva Convention made no specific provision for female enemy personnel captured in uniform but not classified as combat troops. The U.S. Army decided pragmatically: treat them as POWs, but keep them segregated, supervised, and protected. That meant reassigning barracks, modifying latrines, setting up separate compounds, and adjusting guard rosters. In some cases, female American personnel, WACS nurses, clerks, were brought in to handle processing tasks that male guards were not permitted to perform. But the WAC organization had its own responsibilities, and such assistance was not always available. Thus the U.S. Army improvised. Women were housed in smaller, isolated sections within larger camps. American female medical staff performed examinations where possible. Male guards were instructed to maintain strict distance and adhere rigidly to protocol. Contact with male POWs was prohibited. The situation was awkward, but it worked. An unexpected encounter with American women for many German auxiliaries. The shock of seeing American men was soon matched by another surprise: the sight of American women in uniform. Some were WAC truck drivers, ferrying supplies between depots. Others worked in clerical offices, medical stations, or administrative posts. Their presence contradicted nearly everything German women had been told. Here were women wearing trousers, boots, jackets with insignia, women giving orders, women inspecting documents, women driving heavy vehicles through camp gates with a confidence that looked almost unreal to those raised in a system that insisted German women belonged firmly in the domestic sphere. To the female prisoners, this sight carried a quiet, unsettling message. The enemy society was structured differently, almost unrecognizably from their own. American order versus German collapse. What struck many new prisoners most, however, was not ideology or gender roles, but the raw contrast in material conditions. In Germany, rationing had grown severe. Cities lay in ruins. Food supplies were disrupted by bombings. Uniforms were threadbare. Equipment was recycled endlessly. Fuel was scarce. In the American camps, they saw guards with heavy wool coats and polished boots, trucks that seemed endlessly fueled, Medical stations stocked with supplies, kitchens filled with food, warehouses organized with industrial precision. Even the gravel paths looked maintained. The fences were intact. The lights worked. The barracks had stoves. Everything felt functional, abundant, almost excessive to a nation starving. This order was shocking. The first hours behind the fence when a convoy of female prisoners arrived at a camp. The procedures followed a predictable rhythm, one designed for efficiency rather than intimidation. First came the unloading. Then a count. Then registration. Names, ranks, units, birth dates, places of capture. Every detail written down by clerks, sometimes Americans, sometimes German prisoners assigned to administrative duties. Next came medical checks. Lice treatment. Disinfection. Distribution of bedding. The issue of temporary POW tags. Throughout all of this, the American guards maintained distance, posture, and discipline. Many of them were barely older than the women they supervised. But their training, their supplies, and their sense of order created a stark impression. These men belonged to a country that had not yet felt the war reach its home. For the German women, the realization was jarring, because this was not the starving, desperate America they had been warned about. This was something else, something larger, stronger, and disconcertingly calm. And as the gates closed behind them that first day, the women began to understand their captivity would not be a simple pause in the war. It would be a confrontation, slow, quiet, and unyielding with an entirely different world. Fear, sighs, and first impressions when the gate locked behind them. The world narrowed to fences, watchtowers, and the quiet rhythm of military procedure. But beneath that surface order lived the emotions and perceptions that shaped the first crucial hours of captivity. To understand what those women experienced, we must examine the encounter from several angles, each revealing a different thread of the same reality. 1. The human angle: fear, exhaustion, and an unexpected relief for most of these German auxiliaries. Capture came at the end of a long, brutal retreat. They had marched beside shattered infantry units, slept in barns, cellars, and roadside ditches, and eaten whatever could be scavenged. Allied fighter bombers prowled the skies. Roads were choked with refugees. Rumors of Soviet atrocities spread like wildfire. The sense of collapse was everywhere. So by the time an American patrol stopped their convoy or found them hiding near a ruined farmhouse, fear was not a sudden jolt, it was a constant companion. Yet the moment of capture brought a paradox. Yes, there was terror, the unknown procedures, the humiliation of surrender, the stripping away of uniform and identity. But layered beneath that fear was an unmistakable sense of relief. No more running. No more gunfire in the distance. No more orders shouted through cracked radios that no longer made sense. For some, the relief was physical, simply knowing they would not face the Red Army's advance. For others it was emotional, a recognition that the war, at least for them, had finally stopped. But none of them admitted that aloud. Not then, not in front of American guards. The official posture remained stoic. German discipline endured even where the Reich had not. And yet, as they were lined up in the camp yard shivering in their worn greatcoats, clutching their documents, they could not deny the quiet, guilty truth. For the first time in months, they felt safe. *2. The physical angle, the bigness of America given human shape, the shock came first through the eyes. To many of these German women, the American guards looked impossibly large. Not merely tall, but robust, muscular, broad across the shoulders. Their uniforms were thick, tailored, and well-maintained. Their boots heavy. Their belts stiff with equipment. Compared to the gaunt, exhausted German soldiers limping behind retreating lines, the Americans looked like men from another world. This wasn't imagination. For decades before the war, the average American diet had been richer in calories, protein, and vitamins than those in most of Europe. Industrial agriculture, refrigeration, and nationwide distribution gave American soldiers a nutritional base the Germans could not match. Not by 1945, when rationing had carved into every German household. And now, standing face to face with these guards, the women felt as if they had encountered the physical embodiment of American abundance. The sensation was disorienting. They had been told Americans were lazy, undisciplined, and soft. But the men in front of them looked anything but soft. Some German POWs later described this moment as the first crack in the wall, the instant they understood that the war had been fought between opponents who lived in entirely different material realities. The women noticed other details too. The helmets gleaming under sunlight, the rifles clean and well-oiled, the endless pockets of the uniforms filled with unknown items. Small things, but each one reinforced the same point. Here stood men from a country that had never known wartime scarcity. To those who had eaten little more than watery stew for months, even the guards' canteens seemed like symbols of plenty. And yet, the surprise went both ways. American MPs, trained to expect columns of hardened enemy troops, now stood opposite groups of tired young women in gray skirts, shoulder straps faded, hair pinned under field caps. The contrast was striking, and for a moment, both sides simply stared, trying to reconcile the reality with the expectations they had carried across continents. 3. The propaganda angle. When the enemy doesn't match the poster, nothing prepared these women for what they saw, because nothing they had been told was true. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as a chaotic, inferior force, unfit soldiers cobbled together from immigrants, criminals, or Hollywood fantasies. Magazines claimed US troops could not endure hardship. Newsreels mocked their discipline. Party lecturers described them as softened by luxury, incapable of surviving the rigors of the front. Standing in the camp yard, the women realized how carefully crafted those illusions had been. The guards were calm, methodical, detached. They handled prisoners without cruelty, but without hesitation. Their commands were clear, their posture disciplined, their weapons maintained, their uniforms immaculate compared to the patched, threadbare garments in which German units had been fighting. The shock was not that Americans were human. The shock was that they did not resemble the caricatures the Reich had used to shape public belief. It wasn't just the guards' physical strength. It was the competence, the structure, the confidence of men who came from a nation with supplies, fuel, and food to spare while Germany had none left. For the German women, whose worldview had been molded within a controlled information bubble, this encounter felt jarringly intimate. They were seeing the enemy not through slogans or posters, but through proximity, through the way he walked, spoke, and carried himself. And in that proximity, the propaganda dissolved. These three angles, fear, physical shock, and the collapse of myth, formed the emotional foundation of the women's earliest hours in captivity. But as the days turned into weeks, other forces came into play: gender, logistics, morality, and the realities of coexistence behind the wire. Gender, discipline, technology, and morality behind the wire. As the first hours of shock faded, life inside the American camp revealed deeper layers of contrast, layers shaped not only by fear or propaganda, but by gender roles, logistical challenges, and the moral framework that governed how these women were treated. What began as a moment of astonishment slowly evolved into a complex relationship between captor and captive, shaped by daily routines, unexpected encounters, and the vast differences between the worlds they came from. Point 4. The gender angle. Women in uniform on both sides for many female German auxiliaries. The greatest ideological collision came not from the American men guarding them, but from the American women they occasionally saw working alongside them. The sight alone was disorienting. A whack driver rolling past in a heavy truck, engine rumbling. A female American medical orderly checking names at the infirmary. A young woman in trousers, boots, and cap confidently issuing instructions to a group of male enlisted clerks. It contradicted everything the Nazi state had taught. German propaganda had insisted that American society was crumbling because women were abandoning their natural roles. Yet here, behind the wire, those same women were performing duties German policy had deemed unthinkable, driving military vehicles, managing administrative sections, operating radios, and working in personnel offices. To the German auxiliaries trained within a system that placed strict boundaries around female behavior, this was deeply unsettling. If the enemy allowed women such freedom, and the enemy was winning, what did that say about their own society? Some reacted with confusion, others with silent admiration. A few clung stubbornly to the belief that such roles were improper. But the seed had been planted. The world outside Germany did not operate by the same rules. And the war had exposed that truth for all to see. In quiet moments, some prisoners wondered if American women had endured bombardment, starvation, or cold the way German women had. The contrast was painful. The American women looked healthy, confident, well-fed, symbols of a society untouched by total war. For prisoners who had spent months in fear of Soviet capture or fleeing bombardments, seeing women with such authority was both comforting and alien. Their presence suggested stability, order, and protection, yet also exposed how rigidly limited their own roles had been. 5. The logistical angle. Guarding those the system never expected. The U.S. Army's POW system was designed for efficiency, but not for complexity. It had been built to manage vast numbers of male enemy soldiers, not scattered groups of women in auxiliary uniforms. And that created immediate logistical challenges. Segregation was essential. Male German POWs outnumbered the women thousands to one. Housing them together was unthinkable. So entire barracks blocks were cleared, fenced subdivisions rapidly set up, and guard details rearranged. A camp meant for 10,000 men suddenly had to accommodate a few dozen women with special considerations. Medical privacy was another challenge. The Army tried to assign female nurses or WSC personnel to examinations when possible, but shortages meant this could not always be guaranteed. In these moments, the Americans compensated with strict adherence to protocol. Curtains hung, minimal contact, interpreters present, and detailed written procedures to ensure dignity. Security rules were also rewritten. American guards were prohibited from entering female barracks alone. Any disciplinary action required multiple witnesses. Work assignments were limited to safe, supervised tasks. Communication with male POWs was forbidden to prevent fraternization or exploitation. Under these constraints, the guards adopted a near-mechanical professionalism. They followed procedures with rigid precision, not out of coldness, but because discipline protected both sides. Any deviation risked misunderstandings that could escalate into diplomatic issues or allegations of mistreatment. For the prisoners, this strictness was surprising. They had expected either brutality or chaos. Instead, they encountered a bureaucracy that treated rules like scripture, and that realization carried its own weight. It meant they were seen not as trophies or targets, but as responsibilities within a system larger than any individual guard. 6. The moral angle, education, exposure, and the slow undoing of certainty. Perhaps the most subtle angle of captivity was also the most transformative. Exposure to ideas and freedoms they had never known. American camps were not simply places of confinement. They were organized environments governed by principles of the Geneva Convention, monitored by the Red Cross, and often equipped with libraries, classes, and structured work programs. For male POWs, these programs were extensive. For female prisoners, far fewer in number, the opportunities were limited. but still present. What mattered most was not the scale, but the environment itself, inside the wire. German women saw newspapers that printed Allied victories without censorship, radios broadcasting news without ideological filters, books that were not banned, guards who enforced rules without cruelty, African American soldiers working alongside white Americans, contradicting Nazi racial doctrine simply by existing in uniform, even when not directly offered re-education. The very act of living among these realities had a quiet, cumulative effect. Every newspaper, every broadcast, every orderly meal, every display of fairness, each one chipped away at the worldview they had been taught. Some resisted fiercely. Others adapted quickly. Most fell somewhere in between, conflicted, questioning, trying to reconcile the disciplined, methodical American camp with the enemy described in German classrooms. But the truth was unavoidable. The enemy was not who they had been told he was, and that recognition, though rarely spoken aloud, began to alter how they understood the war and themselves. These layers, gender shock, logistical restructuring, and moral recalibration, shaped the deeper fabric of captivity. They set the stage for a turning point far less dramatic than combat, yet just as decisive in its impact. Processing Day. From prisoners of a Reich to prisoners of a rulebook, the decisive moment did not come with gunfire or marching boots. It came with paperwork. On their first full day inside the American POW camp, the German women faced a process that was, in its own quiet way, more overwhelming than the moment they surrendered. Capture had been chaotic shouts, raised hands, white flags improvised from torn cloth. But processing was something else entirely. A transition from the collapsing world of the Reich into the precise, mechanical world of the United States Army. The first summons came at dawn. A whistle shrilled outside the barracks. Boots crunched over gravel. The metal door creaked open, and a military police sergeant signaled them out. The women filed into formation, shivering in the cold, clutching their identification papers, some carefully preserved, some creased from weeks of retreat. A guard with a clipboard moved along the line, reading names off a list and checking them against their dog tags. There were no threats, no raised voices, only procedure. That in itself was unsettling. The disassembly of identity processing began in a long, low building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet wood. Inside, tables had been arranged in a sequence. The women moved from one to the next, each station stripping away a layer of their former identity. First came personal information: full name, date of birth, home address, unit designation, date and location of capture. An American clerk wrote everything in block letters on standardized forms, pausing occasionally to confirm spellings. Then came inventory. Every item they carried, pocket knife, notebook, watch, ring, photograph, was cataloged. Anything deemed military property, including insignia or equipment, was confiscated and logged. Personal items were bagged and tagged. To the American personnel, it was routine. To the women, it felt like a dismantling. The Reich had already abandoned them. Now its symbols were taken away piece by piece. At the next table, interpreters in clean uniforms translated instructions. Some were German Americans who spoke with unfamiliar accents. Others were German POWs assigned to administrative work. Their presence was strange prisoners assisting in the processing of other prisoners, but their neutrality helped reduce tension. For many women, the moment that jarred them most was the medical inspection. Not because it was abusive, but because it was so systematic. A female American nurse, when available, conducted the exam. Otherwise, medical officers operated with rigid professionalism, minimal contact, and detailed protocol. The women were checked for lice, infection, injuries. Blankets were handed out, soap, towels. A mixture of embarrassment and relief spread through the room. After weeks of cold, fear, and flight, Being examined by trained staff in a clean space felt unreal. No one shouted. No one pushed them. No one treated them as trophies of war. What struck them most was the impression that every guard, every medic, every clerk behaved as if they were not individuals, but entries in a large, impersonal system. It was not kindness, and it was not cruelty. It was order. Pure, disciplined order. The first meal, a quiet turning point after processing. The women were marched to the mess hall. The building was warm inside, heated by a coal stove. The smell of food, real food, hot food filled the air. The cooks, some American and some German, POWs on work detail, ladled portions onto metal trays, bread, stew with meat, potatoes, coffee, sometimes even fruit. To women who had eaten little more than thin soup and hard crusts for months, the sight was almost dizzying. Some ate slowly, suspiciously. Others devoured everything, unable to hide their hunger. Across the room, American guards watched without comment. It was here, more than at the gate or during processing, that the quiet fracture deepened. How could a nation feed its prisoners this way when Germany could not feed its own citizens? The propaganda they had grown up with about American weakness, American decadence, American indiscipline, did not fit the steaming bowl in front of them. It did not fit the clean kitchen, the organized line, or the calm guards at the door, a prisoner later recalled. It was the first time I understood we had been lied to. The women in this camp did not record such statements. But the sentiment hung in the room like a silent verdict. The moment everything shifts after the meal. They were marched outside for the final step. Assignment. The sun was climbing, burning away the morning chill. The parade ground lay bare between the barracks. American MPs stood spaced evenly, rifles slung, boots planted firmly in the gravel. One of the women, her name never preserved, later remembered the sensation of walking down the line. The guards seemed impossibly tall, their silhouettes blotting out the sky, and here, in this moment, the title of this documentary finds its most literal truth. They had heard rumors. They had whispered it in the trucks. But seeing them up close was different. The Americans were big, broad-chested, muscular, radiating a physical confidence that came from more than training. It came from nutrition, resources, and a society that had grown stronger, not weaker under the pressure of war. In the Reich, even healthy soldiers looked thinner by 1945. Here, the guards looked untouched by deprivation. One woman, barely more than a girl, stared at the nearest MP in disbelief. Though she spoke no English, the astonishment needed no translation. Others exchanged glances that said the same thing. We didn't expect them to be this big. Not monstrous. Not brutal. Not deformed or decadent as posters had claimed. Just large. Healthy. Completely unlike the enemy they had been taught to imagine. In that instant, the war shifted from ideology to reality. Not because of a battle. Not because of a speech. But because of a simple, human encounter across a strip of gravel, an encounter that broke years of manufactured belief. The sun climbed higher. The guards called out barrack assignments. Groups were led away. The women followed, still processing what they had just seen. They had entered the camp as soldiers of a collapsing empire. They would leave this day as prisoners of a nation whose strength they were only beginning to understand. Routine becomes revelation. Life under American guard. The drama of arrival faded quickly. Once the women were assigned to their barracks and the initial astonishment subsided, the camp shifted into its steady, almost mechanical rhythm. It was this rhythm, not violence, not chaos, that shaped the true turning point of their captivity. For in the quiet repetition of daily routine, the German women began to observe things that challenged far more than their expectations of the enemy. It challenged their understanding of the world itself. The discipline of the day every morning began the same way. A whistle. Boots approaching. A voice calling roll. Inside the barracks, the women folded blankets military style. Outside, a guard stood waiting with a clipboard. His face rarely changed, expressionless, focused on procedure. Names were read, numbers matched, and any absences or illness reported. This discipline was startling not because it was strict, but because it was predictable. Back in the final months of the Reich, predictability had vanished entirely. Command posts were relocated overnight. Orders contradicted one another. Supplies failed to arrive. Lines of communication broke down. Fear filled the gaps. Here, in captivity, the women encountered something they had not experienced for months. Structure. After roll call came work details. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were allowed and in some cases required to work. For most female POWs, this meant safe tasks inside the camp: laundry, sewing, kitchen help, groundskeeping, or clerical support. Always under supervision, always documented. There was no shouting, no beatings, no arbitrary punishments. Just the steady application of rules. The monotony was heavy. But beneath it, something quieter was happening. The growing awareness that the war outside the wire operated under a different logic than the war inside their minds. The guards, impersonal, predictable, professional at first. The women watched the American guards with fear. But as the days passed, fear gave way to something else: fascination. The men rotated in shifts. They appeared on time, left on time, marched in pairs, and conducted searches with an exactness that bordered on ritual. There were no displays of rage or triumph. No need for theatrics. These were soldiers whose victory did not require constant reminder. Confusion often replaced fear. If these Americans were the decadent, chaotic men German propaganda had described, why did they behave like this? Why did they stand so straight, watch so carefully, enforce rules so consistently? More than one prisoner realized the answer. They did not fear the future. Their country was not collapsing. Their families were not starving. Their uniforms were not threadbare. Their superiors were not calling for suicidal counterattacks. These guards were not fighting for survival. They were maintaining order on behalf of a nation that still had strength to spare, and that was perhaps the most devastating truth of all. Unexpected encounters and quiet comparisons, other moments added to the slow transformation taking place. A woman sent to the infirmary for a fever saw. American medical equipment cleaner and more advanced than anything she had seen in Germany since the bombing campaigns intensified. The nurse, American or German POW, gave her aspirin, clean water, and rest. No interrogation. No humiliation. Another escort detail brought a small group near the administrative building, where American women in uniform carried clipboards or typewriters. Their movements calm, efficient, authoritative. For a German auxiliary trained to serve quietly in the background, the sight of women directing offices, driving vehicles, or coordinating logistics struck like a revelation. These were not nations at the same stage of desperation. One was fighting for existence. The other was conducting a global war without losing its social stability. Late in the evenings, when the lights dimmed and guards paced outside, quiet conversations rippled through the bunks. The women spoke in whispers. Did you see how many supplies they have? Did you notice the guards' rations? Why do American women have more authority than we did? How are they so calm? How can they be this strong? None could answer. But the questions themselves revealed the shift underway. A fracture in the mind. Climax of their psychological transformation was not a single dramatic event, but a realization that grew day by day. Everything they had believed about the enemy was wrong, not simply the stereotypes, not simply the propaganda, but the broader worldview that placed Germany at the center of history, destined to triumph through strength and purity. Now they were face to face with a nation that had achieved military dominance without the ideological fanaticism that had shaped their upbringing. A nation where abundance seemed natural, where technology seemed effortless, where discipline did not depend on fear. This discrepancy gnawed at them more deeply than any interrogation. For some, it sparked resentment. For others, confusion. For many, silent admiration. But for all of them, it marked the beginning of a profound internal shift. The war had forced them into roles they never expected to play: soldiers, helpers, frontline evacuees, captives. Now captivity forced them into a different and even more uncomfortable role. Witnesses to the truth that Germany had fought an enemy it fundamentally misunderstood. The night thoughts as darkness settled and the camp quieted. The women lay awake on thin mattresses, listening to the muffled rhythm of American trucks passing on distant roads. Each convoy's rumbling carried the same message. The enemy was moving, organized, supplied, unbroken. Inside the barracks, a different silence rolled over them, a silence heavy with recognition. For the first time, they were not afraid of the Americans themselves. They were afraid of what the Americans represented: a world larger, stronger, and more modern than anything the Reich had prepared them to face. This was the true climax of their captivity. Not the moment of surrender, not the shock at the gate, but the dawning awareness that the war was lost long before they ever crossed the camp's threshold. They did not yet know what would come next, how long they would stay, how they would be released, how Germany would look when they returned. But one thing had already become clear. Captivity had not merely separated them from the Reich, it had severed them from the illusions that had shaped their understanding of it. Home to ruins, release from a comfortable captivity. By the spring and summer of 1945, the war that had shaped every aspect of these women's lives finally ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years collapsed in a matter of days. Flags changed overnight. Borders vanished. Armies dissolved. And in the American POW camps scattered across Europe and the United States, the news arrived not with fanfare, but with a heavy silence, for the German women held behind American fences. The end of the war brought a strange mixture of emotions: relief, uncertainty, and a new kind of fear. The guns had stopped, but the future had not yet begun. They were no longer prisoners of a wartime enemy. They were now detainees of a victor's administration that had to rebuild a continent. Administrative shift: with the ceasefire came new directives. Posts were no longer processed strictly under wartime rules. Everything turned toward repatriation: massive, complicated movements involving hundreds of thousands of people. Each prisoner required documentation, clearance, medical evaluation, and transport arrangements. For the women, their rare status made the process both easier and slower. Easier because their numbers were small. Slower because camps had to determine where they belonged: military units, civilian administrations, displaced persons lists. Some had been uniformed auxiliaries. Others had been civilian employees attached to military commands. A few carried no documents at all. Their files were reviewed with careful attention. Clerks asked new questions. Interpreters revisited old answers. Each woman was categorized before release: fit for travel, fit for labor, medically vulnerable, or in need of further evaluation. The women rarely protested these steps. Bureaucracy, while tedious, was familiar ground, more familiar than the ruins waiting outside the wire. The paradox of safety for many. Captivity had become the safest chapter of the final year of the war. In the camps, they received meals, shelter, medical care, and protection. There were rules, sometimes strict, sometimes frustrating, but there was also order. There were no bombs falling at night, no desperate retreats, no rumors of encirclement, no fear of the Eastern Front's advance. Some male POWs later wrote openly that American camps had felt like islands of calm compared to the devastation of post-war Germany. Though female POW accounts are far rarer, the experience was similar. It was a paradox that few spoke aloud. Life behind the wire had often been preferable to life outside it. Of course, captivity was never comfortable in a deeper sense. There was humiliation in having lost, shame in having served a defeated regime, anxiety about missing family members, and uncertainty about how they would be received once home. Yet compared to the chaos that awaited them, the American camps offered an uneasy but undeniable security. The journey back transport home varied widely. Some women traveled by truck convoys to nearby German towns. Others were sent by train to designated disembarkation points, where Allied authorities handed them over to local administrations. A few were repatriated as part of larger transfers organized between Allied powers. The journeys themselves were sobering. Through the truck windows or train slats, they saw landscapes unrecognizable from the world they remembered. Cities flattened into gray fields of rubble, roads clogged with displaced civilians, warehouses burned out and hollow, farms abandoned or stripped bare, railway stations shattered, entire neighborhoods erased, children scavenged near ruins, elderly men dragged carts piled with salvaged bricks, women with soot-stained faces queued for hours at makeshift soup kitchens. Every scene carried the same message. Germany had lost more than a war. It had lost the world it once assumed would last forever. Many former auxiliaries returned to find their homes destroyed or occupied, their families scattered, their towns unrecognizable. Some walked for days searching for relatives. Others slept in basements or improvised shelters because their old bedrooms no longer existed. The contrast with American captivity could not have been sharper. Behind the wire, there had been stability. Outside the wire, there was only aftermath. The quiet return. The German women who had served as auxiliaries rarely spoke publicly about their captivity. Upon returning, they found a society that did not want to hear about their experiences. Germany was focused on survival, reconstruction, and reckoning. There was little space for stories about being held in American camp, stories that complicated the narrative of victimhood and destruction. Some kept the memory locked away for decades. Others shared fragments with family members only in old age. Many buried their auxiliary service entirely, folding themselves back into civilian life as if the uniform had never existed. But regardless of how much they spoke about it, the impact of that experience stayed with them. In their first days of freedom, many found themselves thinking back not to the moment of surrender, but to the moment they had first seen the American Guards towering, disciplined, and quietly confident. It was the moment when the war's true balance had become undeniable. The women had returned home, but the war had left marks on them that no paperwork, no repatriation order, and no journey across a shattered Germany could erase. Those marks would shape what came next: silence, memory, and the hidden story of female POWs. When the German women finally returned home, their captivity entered a new and quieter phase, one not defined by fences or guards, but by silence. Their experience, unusual and difficult to categorize, slipped into the shadows of history. Male soldiers returned in the millions, and their stories, whether heroic, tragic, or bitter, dominated the public conversation. The women who had served in auxiliary roles often found themselves pushed aside, their voices softened by a society eager to rebuild and reluctant to remember. What they carried in their minds, however, was lasting. A story without a place. Post-war Germany became a nation of ruins and reconstruction. And in this environment, the narrative of the war became selective. Women who had served in uniform occupied an awkward position. They were not seen as soldiers, yet they had served the military. They were not civilians, yet they were never fully recognized as combatants. Their captivity under American Guard did not fit cleanly into any category of public remembrance. Most chose silence. Part of that silence came from shame. They had served a regime that was now condemned. Even those who had taken only clerical or communications roles feared being judged as ideological believers. Another part came from fear of being seen as collaborators, fear of being blamed for the war, fear of being misunderstood in a society trying to rebuild. Moral order from the ashes, and there was one more reason. Their story lacked the dramatic suffering that became central to Germany's memory of the war. The experiences of male POWs in Soviet camps, starvation, disease, years of forced labor came to dominate the national psyche. Against that backdrop, the relative safety and stability of American captivity felt almost unspeakable. It did not fit the narrative of national tragedy. So the experiences of women who had lived behind American fences disappeared from conversation, preserved only in private recollections, the weight of observation. Yet for those women, captivity had left a deeper imprint than they ever revealed publicly, while they rarely framed it this way. Their time in American custody had exposed them to ideas that would quietly echo through their post-war lives: the sight of women in authoritative roles, the discipline of a military built on professionalism rather than ideology, the clean order of a camp where rules protected both guards and prisoners, the abundance of a nation untouched by the hunger ravaging Germany, the presence of racial diversity in American uniforms, challenging doctrines they had been raised to accept. Many would never speak these observations aloud, but the impressions remained. They had entered captivity believing one picture of the enemy and left with another, sharper, more human, and far more complex. For some, it became a silent reference point, a comparison of two worlds, one collapsing and the other ascendant. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions about the beliefs they had once held. Not all rejected those beliefs immediately, and some never did. But the memory of that first encounter, of the towering guards, of the system that functioned without fear, lingered stubbornly. In it lay a quiet education, rebuilding lives in a broken nation. Most former auxiliaries returned to a Germany where survival overshadowed reflection. They rebuilt homes, raised families, took civilian jobs, and buried the uniforms they had once worn. The years passed. The rubble was cleared. The Wirtschaftswunder, wonder, the economic miracle, transformed cities and created new hopes. Life moved forward, but history remained inside them. Decades later, when they spoke about the war at all, their recollections came in fragments. A whistle at dawn in the camp, the smell of American coffee, the sharp silhouette of guards against a rising sun, the surprising politeness of a military police sergeant, the first encounter with American female personnel, the shock of seeing soldiers who looked not exhausted, but powerful and calm. These fragments revealed something that official histories had long overlooked. For these women, captivity had been a moment of profound confrontation, not with violence, but with clarity. It had shown them the scale of the world beyond Germany's borders. It had exposed the lies they had been fed. It had stripped away the illusions that had built the war in the first place, a memory that refused to fade in old age. Some former auxiliaries finally acknowledged the truth quietly, almost reluctantly. What surprised me most was how strong the Americans were. They did not behave like the monsters we were told about. They were big, healthy, confident. It was then I realized the war was hopelessly lost. These were simple statements, but they spoke volumes. The memory of those first American guards standing at the gate, tall, calm, larger than life, held more meaning than they dared admit for decades. It was not just a memory of physical size. It was a memory of contrast, between a collapsing Reich and a rising superpower, between propaganda and reality, between fear and the unexpected stability of captivity. It became one of the quiet truths of their lives. The women returned home, raised families, and lived out their days in a Germany that rebuilt itself economically, politically, and morally. But the memory of those early moments in American captivity remained a personal, unspoken testament to the day when the war's myths finally crumbled, and the world revealed itself as it truly was, giants' myths, and the weight of reality in the decades that followed the Second World War. The women who had lived behind American barbed wire rarely spoke of their experience. It did not fit comfortably into any national narrative, not into Germany's story of ruin and rebuilding, nor into America's story of victory and power. But privately, quietly, the memory stayed with them, carried through the years like a single sharp image that refused to fade. That moment at the gate, the shock of seeing the American guards broad-shouldered, well-fed, disciplined, calm was more than a physical impression. It was symbolic. Those men represented a reality they had never been allowed to imagine. A nation whose strength was not theatrical or ideological, but practical, industrial, and deeply rooted. A nation whose confidence came not from propaganda, but from abundance and stability. In that instant, the women realized something profound. The war they had lived through was not simply a clash of armies, it was a clash of worlds. Their world, shaped by fear, scarcity, and totalitarian control, had convinced them of its own strength. The world now standing before them revealed how fragile that belief had always been. The Americans were not giants in a mythical sense. They were giants in the human sense, men shaped by a society that had thrived while Germany starved. Men who had come from a country that fought a global war without losing its footing at home. For the German auxiliaries, that realization carried both humiliation and clarity. It marked the end of illusion, the end of the stories they had been told since childhood, and the beginning of an understanding that the world was far wider, more diverse, and more powerful than the Reich had ever allowed them to see. In the quiet years that followed, they rarely shared this revelation. But in their private thoughts, long after the fences had rusted and the guard towers had become museum relics, the memory remained. The day they stepped down from the truck, looked up, and understood that the war was over, not because Germany had lost its faith, but because it had never understood the true scale of the forces it had challenged. A moment when myth gave way to reality. A moment when fear gave way to comprehension. A moment when the giants at the gate showed them the true size of the world beyond. If you found this documentary powerful, consider supporting the channel so we can continue uncovering the hidden human stories of the Second World War. Like the video, it helps the story reach more people. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective adds to the historical discussion. Subscribe and turn on notifications. More cinematic, deeply researched World War II documentaries are on the way. And if you want to see a follow-up exploring the experience of German male POWs in American camps, or how American women in uniform transformed expectations on the home front, let me know below. Your support keeps these stories alive.